Good morning. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session on the ethics of analytics, the limits of anonymization. Can you hear me now? Yes. Now, okay? Great. Again, good morning, and welcome to the session on the ethics of analytics and the limits of anonymization. Our panel is going to consider two related and central issues in the debate about privacy and data protection, the ethics of analytics and the limits of anonymization. The analysis of data about individuals is a crucial input in many areas of activity. Such analysis helps companies to better target consumers. It allows health researchers to deliver cures for disease. It can help states to identify threats to their security. And there are many other examples which those of you in the audience can come up with. But what about the rights of individuals when their data is being analysed? Do they have an absolute right to refuse all such uses of their personal data? What are the circumstances in which their personal data can be used without their consent? And how do fair information and data protection principles apply in the context of the use of analytics in various industries and at various stages of such use? And going beyond legal requirements, what are the ethical guidelines that should apply to users of analytical tools? Now, anonymization is often the answer offered to resolve conflict in this area. Once you effectively delink the data from the individual, it is no longer personal data. But in a world where so much information about all of us is publicly available, how effective are the anonymization techniques most commonly applied? And we had some questioning of this, in fact, in the last plenary session. Now, we have a very distinguished panel to address these issues for us. Paul Ohm of the University of Colorado Law School, Cynthia Dwork of Microsoft, Pierre-Yves Lastic of Sanofi Aventis, Moni Naour of the Weizmann Institute, and Harriet Pearson of IBM, who will be our moderator. Harriet.
Excellent, thank you. So good morning, everyone, and hello to anyone who might be watching us on the web. This session is intended to provide a sense of the issues and of the latest thinking as it relates to the use of analytics. What is analytics? What are some of the issues connected to privacy? How does one think about the application of fair information principles to analytics? And very importantly, we're going to explore the almost adjacent topic of the limits of anonymization or de-identification as it relates to protecting privacy via that technique, as Billy said. So we have a distinguished panel of cryptographers, of biologists, business people, law professors, policy types, and of course our chair, our regulator, to have this conversation. And as you know, these breakout sessions will include audience questions and comments. So I would encourage you to think about those comments that you might have or questions so that you can pose them during the ample time that we have. So let me begin with a few framing thoughts just to bring us to a common platform from which to spring into discussion. Those of you that might have been here at the OECD conference earlier this week may remember there was a very good panel discussion on analytics. And a large part of that discussion, I think, consisted of having a view of what is this thing called the data deluge. And whether you call it data deluge or, as The Economist called it, big data a few months ago. There was if you remember, there was a cover story called Big Data. There is something happening that is making this issue and topic a timely one for this year's conference, and I think for years beyond. And I would say that there are a few things happening. But first, let's go to first principles. We have, in our societies, always used information to understand better the past and predict the future. And I would say with varying degrees of success. There is a famous example that I remember from, I don't know, maybe more than 10 years ago, maybe more than that, from the field of consumer marketing that tells us that, and I think I remember this because I may have had young children at the time, that men who were sent to the store or go to the store to buy diapers for the baby, you know, are much more likely to buy beer at the same time. Who knew, right? So this, you know, whether the information was gathered from the store and their own sales, or whether the grocery store or the store gathered the information from a third party and sourced it from there. This is a long ago example of how data about consumer or individual buying behaviors might be used to configure a store so that we could facilitate the demonstration of this highly desirable behavior in the eyes, of course, of the men and the store. So, maybe not the baby, I don't know. But this insight, or more accurately, the prediction of such behavior, when taken from an aggregate sample and then applied to the environment in which individuals then go and do their activity, that was derived from data. And so this has been going on for quite a long time, and the application of fair information principles or regulation or best practices or norms, that too has been underway for quite a time. But there are two developments here that make it different, I would put forward as an issue from now and going forward. First, this chart, the slide that's up here on the world of data. This is, I think, a fairly recent picture. It nicely captures some of those statistics that I think we've been hearing about, and I would read a few just so that you could appreciate them. So in digital form, data is generated from all sorts of activities, and in digital form, this shows us 2.9 million emails per second, 500 million tweets per day, 700 billion minutes spent on Facebook each month, and this is a large part of this is about data being generated by individual behavior. I would also remark that data is being generated by instrumentation, intelligent devices that are embedded in inanimate objects or things that have nothing to do with individual behavior. So I was reading my college magazine, my alumni magazine, a few weeks ago, and there was a story in there about a nice alum who had left money or given money to build a bridge on campus, a bridge to connect one part of campus to the other. And this article was quite long to describe what essentially was a bridge. So I figured, okay, it's a long article because it's really trying to be grateful to this alum who's given money. But I read the article more carefully, and the theme of the article was that this was a smart bridge. And why was it a smart bridge? It had sensors embedded throughout the span, in the concrete, in the various places in the bridge, and all of those sensors were transmitting different information back to the building or the campus engineers to tell it the kind of stresses and strains and cracks and whatnot the bridge was going to experience. And so the idea was that this smart bridge was expensive to build at the beginning, which is why they needed so much more money from the alum, but also it would be less expensive and more safe. So that's an example of the amount of data being generated by these points, these intelligent points, exploding, available to conduct analyses that relate to safety or to other purposes, and we'll get into a few use cases that are more relevant to individual data in a second. The second thing that's happening is that there have been advances in math and science technology that make it possible to extract more predictive insights from such data. So not only quantitatively more data, but qualitatively the ability to create probabilistic models or other ways of generating insights that can assist organizations or individuals to make use of data. And so I think earlier in the conference somebody used the example of Google, the Google service that allows individuals to find out if people are reporting flu in the area, right? So you can get a better sense of epidemiological patterns as an individual, so you make use of that sort of thing. So, and as the advances in technology have occurred, so have other advances, frankly, that are putting in tension the ability actually to rely on some foundational elements, and this is where the limits of anonymization comes in, that are putting in tension the ability to rely on certain techniques that have been used in the past to resolve this tension of how can I access information and derive value from it. There have been limits on that, and then, of course, there's work underway to try to resolve those limits, and a few of our panelists are going to talk about that. So taken together, these two trends, the big data, more data, deluge of data, combined with better methods to analyze it, they create opportunities and they create new abilities. But of course, they also create a challenge or some questions, perhaps, or some work to do for many of us to try to address privacy and data protection and, frankly, the ethics and the norms that need to accompany use of such tools. So, so this panel is going to, as I said, surface these issues and guide us. And we have two theoretical researchers, cryptographers, who've done some foundational work. We have a law professor who's done some really thoughtful work that combines technology and law, and we have a biologist, who, and I'm going to start with Pierre to kind of talk to us about how to think about, in an actual use case, in an actual industry, how to understand what is analytics. And maybe just begin with a little bit of a foundation in that area, because when I first heard the word analytics several years ago, my first question was, is that the same thing as data mining? Is that a question that anyone might have? Yeah, I think so. Or how is it different? What does it include? Is it as simple as, and this is Cynthia's definition for me, computing on data? Okay. But what does it actually mean in practice? So I'm going to ask Pierre to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to follow up with a couple of observations on some work to develop some privacy-related principles, and then throw it to the rest of the panel. Pierre?
Thank you, Harriet, for the introduction. It's quite a difficult task to try to make medical and clinical research understandable in a few minutes. So I'm trying to give you just the basics that we need for understanding how we work with data, and also look at the problem of anonymization when it comes to medical research. Everybody is a patient. You and me, we were probably born in a hospital, and from this day on we have been, data about our health status has been collected mainly on paper file if you are as old as me, and if you are younger, then probably already in electronic form. When you want to treat somebody, you need to know a certain number of information about the person's behavior. So are you a smoker? What kind of food do you take? You need to have some information about your medical history, what kind of disease you had, and also what your family medical history is. So if you're a woman and your sister and your mother died of breast cancer, there is a high probability that you will also die of breast cancer. So, and here we are touching information that relates not only to yourself, but also to your family and your relatives. And of course, more and more, as the incredible progress of genetics has led us to a better understanding of diseases, and also the possibility to cure diseases that were lethal only a few decades ago. Cancer was lethal in most cases 30 years ago. Now there are a number of cancers that are cured, and the example of breast cancer, you have 80% probability that you will survive breast cancer now, which was not the case before. And one of the most relevant changes came from the understanding on how cancer is heavily influenced by our genetic predisposition, but also environmental conditions and our behavior. So if you want to treat somebody, of course, you will have this information for one patient. If we want to invent new treatment, if you want to understand diseases better, then you need to collect information about many, many individuals, hundreds, thousands, millions of people, and this information will help us to find relationships between your genetic background, your environmental conditions, and the disease that you have, and the potential treatment for this disease. And I encourage you to go this afternoon to a session in the same room, which is led by my colleague from Merck, Hilary Wandel, which will be about personalized medicine, because now we are moving from a medicine of the mass, where everybody would take aspirin for headache, for example, and have a number of side effects for a number of people also. Now we are moving towards a medicine which is much more targeted to one individual. But that means that in order to develop this kind of treatment, I need to have access to very large amount of genetic information, environmental information, and so on. Now, the problem that we have with this information that it can be used also to harm people. And it is clear that we all know that health information is heavily protected, is sensitive data, because you can maybe lose your job, you can be refused an insurance because of certain medical condition, and we all know that this data needs to be protected as much as possible. So how do we combine, how do we balance the need for medical research for having access to this kind of information and the imperious need also to protect this individual information? And there we come to the second part, which is anonymization. Well, there are a few anonymized databases, which are mainly epidemiology databases, where we look as a correlation between, let's say, do you have a higher risk of cancer if you live close to a nuclear plant? I actually live a few kilometers away from one, and I hope that, well, you see? But actually, if you are living in Europe, there is a high probability that you don't live more than 100 kilometers away from a nuclear plant, and this is true for many, many countries in the world. So we are, of course, this correlation gives you a general idea, but of course, this information is limited to one simple question. If you want to go into the real causes of diseases, then you have to have much more information, because people react differently, and it is not sufficient to know how close you live to a nuclear plant in order to decide if the cancer you have is linked to this information, or maybe because you have been a smoker for 20 years, or because you have a history in your family of lung cancer. So what we do use in medical research is more called pseudonymization, and I think that Alexander Dix mentioned the term a number of times yesterday. Pseudonymization is nothing else that there is somebody that has a key that allows to link different records belonging to you to your medical information. In general, that will be your doctor. The doctor who is performing a clinical trial in a hospital will have, of course, this person will know you. As a sponsor of a clinical trial, my company, for example, would not have any access to this information, but we are obliged by law to prove that the patient who have been funding our claims that our drug is safe, well, that this patient exists, because there is always, as we know, certain incentive to fraud. So there is a regulatory need to have a link to an individual person, and then there is also a medical need. I will take two examples currently which are happening in the US and in Europe. In the US, the FDA is building a huge clinical data warehouse when they want to store the results of all clinical trials that are used to bring drugs to the market. This represents about 4,000 clinical trials every year that are submitted to FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and these data concern hundreds of thousands of patients every year. Well, there are a lot of discussion of how much of this database should you make public, because there is a public interest. But if you would divulge this lot of information, then we would come in some real issues of potential re-identification of people. And I think that Paul will talk about that. On the other side, if I took the example of the European Medicines Agency, this agency has a database called EudraVigilance, which is used to store serious adverse effects linked to the usage of drugs. Now, in the EU, we have a transparency initiative that makes that EU institution need to be more transparent towards the public. And so EudraVigilance is supposed to be made also available to the public for information about the side effects of drugs. On the other side, of course, you want to protect the privacy of the patient. And so we are currently discussing in an expert working group about which data can we make available and which should be wiped out from the database or not given access to the public. And the more we work on it, and the more, you say, okay, we will get rid, of course, of any possible identifiers like the initials and the exact birth date. Okay, we can manage with age. You need to have age in order to understand diseases, but birth date you can forget. Then you go to, well, we need to know about the location. But then certain people say, no, because with the country and then a certain identifier, you can go back to the person. So we don't take the country. And then you go into the different diseases. Yes, but this disease is very rare. So if this disease is known, then I have a high probability that I can identify the person. And so you get more and more information out of the database, and at the end, you have a useless bunch of bits that cannot be used for pharmacovigilance anymore. And so making it public is basically useless. And so we have here in a good example of how anonymization, I think Paul is going to talk about that also, anonymization means also making data more and more useless. And we have to find a balance between the use of data and the need to protect privacy. And finally, just to conclude, I think that when I speak about all these databases, I'm not in favor of putting these big medical databases on the public access on the web, because I think that the risks are much too important and that we cannot foresee these risks. However, I think that the usage could be allowed for a certain number of individual researchers in public and private research, and that you should have a certain condition for the access and high security measures, but that you need to have meaningful information in these databases, and that we should not, let's say, protect privacy at the cost of not protecting health.
So that's a wonderful example, and as we were prepping for the panel, we asked Pierre to go first because that's probably the single most compelling example of the value that I think we perhaps almost all would agree is one of the most compelling use cases for analytics and the collection and analysis of data that come from many, many different sources potentially. So we don't want to be boring, however, right, in this panel, because now we have to go to places where some of the tensions are going to be perhaps more glaring, more hard to resolve, and will create issues. And before I turn it to Paul to talk about some of the issues that do arise, including this limits of anonymization, to begin us on that discussion, let me comment a little bit more on the slide that I'm trying to bring up. Can somebody help me advance this? No? The one before?
Back one. Yeah.
There.
Nope.
Next one.
Speak quickly.
Thank you. Let me try to put some context around what is analytics and how to start thinking about the policy and probably the technology-related issues associated with it, just working off of the example that Pierre just gave us, and also drawing upon work that a group of organizations has been doing with the convened by the Center for Information Policy Leadership and led by Professor Paul Schwartz at Berkeley Law School. In the bibliography for the session today, there's actually a citation to a paper that Professor Schwartz has been writing that tries to address these issues in the context of fair information principles and this broader concept of what is ethical, what is the set of norms that ought to inform where there's not necessarily law, regulation, or accepted practice yet, what are the set of norms that should inform the use of analytics. And one of the categorizations we have developed, and it helped to try to break up this complex topic, was that there really are at least 4 stages of analytics. If one is engaging in analytics, you know, how do you think about the life cycle? How do you think about the project or the initiative? And there's really the first stage is collection of information, right? You might collect the information directly from an individual, from the bridge, or you could source it from a third party, or it may be self-disclosed by individuals from Facebook, social networks, etc. There's that stage, and the application of whether one does collect the information, how much of it to collect, those are all, you know, questions. The second stage is then taking this information and analyzing it, you know, integrating it, figuring out how to combine the data sets, whether to combine them, whether to anonymize or pseudonymize elements of it before combining them, and conducting an analysis that yields some kind of probabilistic outcome, some insight. The third stage is what to do about that. What kind of decision do you make? Do you design your store differently, or do you make a decision about an identifiable individual? And the consequences of that and how one is accountable for the decision, has oversight for that decision, et cetera. And then the final one is to figure out if the way that this was done was appropriate, some additional oversight, and some revision. So if you think about that in the context of the health information or the pharmaceutical research example, you can see, you know, a little bit about the life cycle. And then if you think about it in another fairly typical use, which is marketing information, online marketing, behavioral advertising, that sort of thing, you also kind of think about this issue as well, which is, okay, the data is collected, it's analyzed, et cetera, and how do the fair information practice principles apply? Paul, in the context of the work that you've done, would you like to comment a little bit on the kind of this online marketing, and in the context of that, the way to think about the distinction between personal information and information that's not classically been thought of as personal, and how one jumps off of that analysis point to get into the application of fair information practice principles?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And, it's really an honor to be here. And those of you in the room don't have the benefit of having experienced the wonderful prep calls that we had. Harriet has been very vigilant in keeping us organized and having us discuss some of this in advance. And I will tell you, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but it was amazing how long a debate we had to have over what we meant by analytics. And so one of the questions that's implicitly out there in this entire panel is, what is analytics? And I really am coming to decide that it depends on your context, but it seems like a word that arises much more out of business, perhaps in an attempt to describe what is being done without using the phrase data mining. But when you cross the transom to the academic side, it's a term that's a little more foreign, and it's a term that I think we're going to have to start to reckon with. Is it different than computing on data? Is it the same thing? Is there an overlap? And then, of course, for the regulators in the room, if the business people keep using this word, then you probably have to begin to understand what they mean by it. So I think the taxonomy you lay out there from Paul Schwartz is probably a very useful start. You know, it's the law professor in me who wants to try and synthesize everything he's seen at this amazing conference into a couple of pithy sentences. And what I really like to think about this amazing conference is, you know, we're talking about shifts in the line between law and technology. And in the work I've done, and I will be the first to tell you that none of my work is original. I'm an import-export specialist. I read computer science papers and then write about them in law journals. In my work, I think what I've done, and it's to my distinct consternation because I am a technologist at heart, I write a couple thousand lines of code every year, but I think that what's happening in the privacy debate is the balance of power, the balance of discussion, and the balance of interesting questions is shifting in healthy ways from the technologist realm to the lawyer's realm. And although that probably strikes terror into the hearts of many of your many of the people in the audience, including lots of technologists who I respect very much, you must understand that the reason this is so is because the balance used to be entirely on the technology side. I picture what it must have been like to have been at the 27th annual Conference of International Commissioners, and I can imagine, and I wasn't there, and I don't even know what city it was in. Does anyone know by any chance? I can imagine that at many times during the proceedings of that conference, someone said, here's a wonderful application, there's some sort of risk of harm to privacy, but don't worry, we've anonymized the data. And at that moment, everybody in the room could have the same self-satisfied grin, right? Take a deep breath, think about the harm that was avoided, and move on to the next question. I think that's the state of affairs it used to be, and you have to understand what a wonderful silver bullet that was. We were talking about a cheap, easy to apply, easy to understand, universal, beloved solution to privacy, one that regulators began to incorporate into every law. And one thing that I've said, and you know, the format of this panel frees me from having to discuss the technology, which I'm indebted to the people to my left for. So let me just talk about what I think, what I call the failure of anonymization, what our panel calls the limits of anonymization, will begin to do to law and policy, and I'll do it in the context of both medicine and behavioral advertising. I honestly think that although every person involved in privacy describes this as an ultimate exercise in balance, anonymization has helped us avoid that balance. That we haven't had to make difficult trade-offs between all sorts of laudable goals that we may have in the name of privacy. And that because anonymization does not work as well, as cheaply, as quickly, as universally as we once believed, because we are about to lose our faith in it, and if there's anyone else in the room who still clings to their faith in it, please ask us questions. We can talk you off of that ledge. But because we're going to lose our ability in that, we are for the first time going to really meaningfully talk about the balances and trade-offs. And I know that we've had conversations about balances, but they've always been kind of in the abstract. We haven't had to face them. And so when we hear Pierre talk about the virtue of medical research, it's hard to quibble with that. And when we hear Pierre raise the risk of harm if somebody discovers that you have some sort of symptom or disease that you don't want them to know about, that's palpable and easy to understand. And as regulators, you may be just struck with the paralysis that comes from realizing that you have to choose between the two. And you're going to have to draw difficult lines. And you're going to have to make value judgments that you're not comfortable that you have to make. For the first time as regulators, you're going to have to realize that privacy means a little less speech, a little less efficiency, innovation, knowledge, health, safety, lives, transparency, all sorts of wonderful things that are in that other pan of the scale are now things that we may need to sacrifice, if just a little, if we want privacy from time to time. And so let's switch from medical privacy, because I agree with Harriet, it's hard to quibble with the ultimate goals of medical research. Now, when you're talking about pharmaceutical marketing, I have a different balance calculation altogether, but let's focus on medical research. But when you shift to the world of behavioral marketing, I think that's where the balancing question is going to be both really interesting to watch and fiercely fought, right? And so what we're really having to do is shake some cobwebs out of our brains and remember what it really means to engage in these balancing exercises in a meaningful way, rather than suppose that some sort of magic wand is going to do it for us. I want to close these opening comments with one thing, which is probably more than is healthy in my paper, which has now been published, by the way. I focus a lot on terminology. I've become quite the pedantic, annoying person when it comes to terminology. And to me, anonymization, pseudonymization, these are words that connote success in ways that we can no longer agree are accurate depictions. And so I walk around to many people, and yesterday was the first time I walked up to the representative from Facebook and I handed in my article and I said, stop saying that you're anonymizing your data, you're not. Read this, you'll see why. That's one thing. And the other one, and I think the one that's harder to give up on is, at least in the United States, the idea of personally identifiable information, or the concept of personal data in Europe. These are concepts that describe a technique that worked really well when anonymization was this robust thing upon which we could all rely. I think we're going to have to realize that we're going to have to give up on some of those strategies in many different places. So that's all I have for opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I don't know if any of you go to a church, but sometimes, you know, you have, I used to go to a church where they had a few places where you go to religious school during the day you observe the Sabbath or the holiday. And some of the rooms were kind of the easy Bible class, and some of the rooms were where really deep questions and the questions you don't really want to ask got debated. And I think this is that kind of panel. I think this is the room where these are really deep concepts, and frankly, they're cutting edge. Two or three of the papers, I think, that are in the bibliography either have just been published or are about to be published. So, I think we'll definitely not walk away from this panel with answers and roadmaps. I think is definitely part of the start of the policy level discussion, at least. So let me ask Cynthia and Moni to now take us deeper. Do you want to operate the clicker? Or do you want? It's the right hand one. To take us deeper into this work of why it is that when you take a few data sets and try to identify, resolve identity, that it's actually perhaps easy to do, or easier than one might think, and then some of the work that she and others have been doing on a concept called differential privacy.
Thank you. Paul has talked a bit about the limits of anonymization. And it's not just anonymization that has limits. Anything, any kind of analytical processes that give you meaningful analyses will ultimately leak some information. It has nothing to do with the particular technology. It just is a fact. If you're getting anything useful out of it, then that's depending on your data. However, not everything is lost, and so I'd like to tell you about some approaches that do manage to get a serious kind of privacy and quite a bit of utility. So we have the anonymization pipe dream, which for some reason advanced. We have an original database. We have a curator who has collected the data, and the anonymization pipe dream is that somehow or other it's possible to take this database and sanitize it, do some magic, make all of the privacy concerns disappear, get rid of the original data, get rid of the curator, and release this anonymized data set. And that question mark there shows the data analyst who interacts with the anonymized data set with no worries about privacy and can ask questions to his or her heart's content and get lots of useful stuff out of it. And of course, this is very ambitious, and it's also extremely vague. What do we mean by privacy? What do we mean by utility? You actually need to have definitions of these things. Now, there is a litany of failures. That, I said, was a pipe dream. I smoked that pipe. I inhaled. And yet, there's just a litany of failures. So you've all heard about the so-called AOL debacle, in which among 20 million records, New York Times reporters were able to identify the anonymized search records of a woman from Georgia. You've all heard probably of LaTanya Sweeney. I don't know what's wrong with this. LaTanya Sweeney's linkage of anonymized medical data with voter registration data, in which she was able to identify the medical records of the then governor of Massachusetts. Now, this is a wonderful example. It took place in the late 90s. I'm going to introduce a piece of terminology here. That voter registration data, that wasn't supposed to be private in any way. The database is the HMO data. The voter registration data is something we call auxiliary or side information. And the point is that the curator may have control over what gets released from the health maintenance organization, but the curator has absolutely no control over what auxiliary information or side information is available to the attacker. And that's tremendously important. You all know about the Netflix Prize cross-linkage, again, an auxiliary information attack in which people in the Netflix Prize training data set were identified by a linkage to the Internet Movie Database, the IMDb. And then there's also some work of Homer et al. On genome-wide association studies, in which they showed that it was possible, given a sample from somebody's DNA, so for example from this water glass over here, it would be possible to tell whether Paul had taken place in a genome-wide association study for some particular disease. Now, the significance of this isn't that we saw Paul's DNA and that his DNA may contain a marker for a disease, but rather that he was identified as having participated in the study. And the people who have participated in the study don't just have a genetic marker, they've actually been diagnosed as having the disease. So you really do learn an extra piece of information here. And this is also a remarkable study because there was no anonymization. All that were released, all that was released were counts of how many people in the study had a popular variant called the major allele in a certain position in the DNA sequence, and how many had the unpopular variant or the minor allele in many, many different positions. So just from these statistics, no anonymized records to try to re-identify and link, just some statistics. So these things have consequences. One of the upshots of the Netflix Prize re-identification was that Netflix abandoned, after a lawsuit, proposed second prize. And the results of this were that statistics that were from studies that were funded from the United States NIH, National Institutes of Health, and the Wellcome Institute were pulled from public access. Okay, so there is a litany. These were all things in the popular press. There's a lot in the literature, the technical literature as well. So what's going wrong in all of these cases? My claim is that what's going wrong is that there's a definitional failure. People who were releasing anonymized data were defining success as having pulled off certain fields. There was no argument that the results of this would give what anybody would actually reasonably consider privacy. We also saw a failure to cope with auxiliary or side information. And so again, auxiliary or side information is anything other than what comes from the database. So it can be other existing databases, databases that will show up in the future that haven't even been conceived of yet. Newspaper reports, Flickr websites, literature, anything. And the definitions are syntactic and they're ad hoc. So we call them the moral equivalent of security through obscurity. Now, there is, in the statistics literature from the late 70s, a non-ad hoc, what I'll call an ad omnia definition of privacy, really a very, very general notion. And it says that intuitively anything that can be learned about a respondent, that means somebody in the database, anything that can be learned about a respondent from the statistical database can be learned without access to the database. And this is, it feels right, it is right, it says that the database is giving you nothing about an individual that you couldn't have gotten from somewhere else. And the problem with this is that Moni and I showed it's completely unachievable. It's provably unachievable. And we'll give you the intuition as to why. And it's an unreasonable argument, but there it is. This is the whole argument. I mean, there are lots of formal things to say, but in a nutshell, this is the whole argument. Suppose you have a database that teaches us, as Pierre suggested, that smoking causes cancer. Well, let's say that smoker Sam is known to the public. Sam is out there, Sam smokes, we know that Sam smokes. That's the auxiliary information. Now the database user who has now learned that smoking causes cancer learns that smoker Sam is at an increased risk for cancer. The database user knows something that the database non-user, who hasn't learned that smoking causes cancer, simply doesn't know. So here, the database, even though it's just a statistical database that taught us that smoking causes cancer, so we know more about Sam than we knew. Sam in particular than we knew before having access to this database. Now, in one sense, you could say Sam is harmed because his insurance premiums rise and he has to pay more and so on. But you could also say that learning that smoking causes cancer is the whole point of the database. It's inherent in the utility of the database. It's one of these things that, as Harriet said, inarguably this is the right use of data, is to learn this kind of thing. And in fact, Sam enrolls in a smoking cessation program and it prolongs his life. Okay? So that's great. So there was a certain amount of harm that came just from the utility of the database. The fact that we learned this this medical fact is useful to us. It's why we want the database. And we want to separate out any harm that comes simply from that fact, which we've decided is worth the risk, from the harm of joining the database. Notice that in this attack, Sam didn't have to be a member of the database. Sam was harmed, that is, the database user learned more about Sam than the non-user. The database user is harmed whether or not Sam is in it. So that suggested a new notion of privacy, which we call differential privacy. It was joint work with Frank McSherry, Kobe Nissim, who's in the audience, and Adam Smith. And the idea in differential privacy is the following. First of all, don't even think anymore about releasing anonymized data and releasing some kind of raw data that has a couple of fields changed. We don't tend to think in those terms anymore. We think more in terms of the database carries out some analyses. You ask a question, you get an answer. Your questions presumably are statistical in nature. How many people in the database both smoke and are over 7 feet tall or whatever. So this new notion says that the values that are computed and released by this database, presumably or possibly in response to questions, should reveal essentially no information about whether the computation used the data of any given individual, no matter what other sources of information are available. So intuitively, you can't tell whether any individual has opted in or opted out of the data set. And what that means, of course, is that the database isn't leaking the raw data of individuals, because that would be an extremely unlikely event if they're not in the data set. And since the outputs should be essentially the same whether anybody is in or out of the database, they can't be there if I'm not in the database, so they won't be there if I am in the database. So again, the values that are computed and released should reveal essentially no information about whether the computation used the data of any given individual, no matter what other sources of information are available. So if you satisfy differential privacy, you will be protected against all linkage attacks, all present and future databases and other sources of information that can come to light. And we can also quantify, and we do quantify, what we mean by essentially no information. So, again, what this does is it separates the harm that's caused by utility from the harm that's caused by participating in the database. And we've been studying now for several years how to actually carry out many important kinds of analyses in a differentially private way that gives good accuracy. One of the important things to remember is that we do this in an interactive fashion now, most of the time. We don't just release anonymized or supposedly anonymized data. The raw data are there. One of the nice things about that is that we can actually now carry out analyses on fields that previously had been suppressed during the during the anonymization process, like geographic information. And there's even a programming platform called PINK for privacy integrated queries that is freely available, and you can use it to analyze data, and you can play with it now. Moni?
Thank you. So maybe it's just to add to what Cynthia had to say. One of the ways you can release information in a differentially private manner is by creating a synthetic database. I mean, it doesn't mean that any synthetic database would satisfy the differential privacy definition, but there are techniques that allow you to release what looks like a real database of real information and real people, but so therefore you can use all your usual tools, so it's compatible, it's software compatible, it's people compatible, but yet it doesn't release any information about, in the differential privacy definition, doesn't release any information about any particular individual that helped create that database. So that is a way you could do it in a non-interactive manner, and then there are also lots of techniques that work interactively. Let me mention another technique that is slightly older than differential privacy, and that is the multi-party computation. So multi-party computation is a technique that is now perhaps 25 years old, the cryptographic techniques that is about 25 years old, and it allows mutually distrusting parties to compute something on joint data. So each one of them has a piece of data. They want to compute some function of that data, but they do not want to release the piece of data that they have to the other side. So that's one area that has received a lot of attention. There's been a lot of progress recently on trying to move the theoretical results into actual implementations. We have two representatives here who are working on it, Yehuda Lindell and Benny Pinkas, right next to Kobe. And so these techniques are also very relevant in the differential privacy, when you want to achieve differential privacy, because, for instance, it means that if you have several agencies that need to combine their information and want to produce, let's say, a synthetic database, they can do so without sharing the information, without sharing the raw data with each other. Using these techniques, they can produce a good database that approximates on many queries the original database, yet doesn't release any particular individual's information. So far, it's the good news. Let's say something about the bad news. The bad news is that
the slides don't work.
The slides don't work exactly.
No bad news.
So let's see, will this work? Maybe this.
Press on the right hand.
Okay, you get to see.
As you do that, so I
Okay.
I don't know how many people in the audience are computer science literate. I try to be, but I'm not sure I completely grasped the concept, completely grasped the concept. But I'm wondering, can you comment as you get to that last slide that differential privacy is not a panacea?
Okay.
Is this a theoretical construct? Is it math? Is it an algorithm? How are we to think about this as a from the drawing board to actually being available to embed in programs? How are we to think about differential privacy and some of these other techniques?
So all of the above. It's a theoretical concept. That means that it's a mathematically rigorous notion of privacy that you can prove theorems about. And it is also, at this point, a growing collection of algorithms. And it is also, at this point, a programming platform, so that somebody who is not schooled in differential privacy can nonetheless program using this platform in a way that achieves differential privacy. This is all of the above.
And it's a measure. It's a number, and you can figure out what it means. It's a meaningful one. It's not just a number. It has a very concrete meaning when you get it. When you're saying, I have 0.1 differential privacy, you can say exactly what that means for an individual.
0.1 is good.
I think you could.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. But, okay, the point is that it's not always applicable. So sometimes it's just too strong. Sometimes you have to release information about an individual. You have to say a particular individual was male, or some rough data about an individual. Differential privacy doesn't capture such cases, because you know if an individual, if an individual was male and the released information is about a male, then or if it's a female and the released information was about a male, then you know that that individual didn't participate. Then it depends. Again, it's a definition and it's a set of techniques. Sometimes the techniques are not applied properly and you get very bad results. Now, so if someone implements something and it turns out bad, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best implementation. There could be many other implementations or other implementations that will yield better results. The point about differential privacy is that you have, it's a way of measuring how good things are. So when you make an implementation, you also have to make the claim that it satisfies a certain degree of differential privacy. Then there is the issue, as you know, if data is used again and again, and some data and information is computed about it throughout its lifetime, then perhaps simply the numbers you'll get are too high. So you'll get a pretty meaningless guarantee of privacy. So the exposure accumulation is something you have to deal with. Again, that is not clear. So you should think in general as you have some amount of privacy that you want to guarantee, and throughout the lifetime of the data, you have to make sure that you're conserving, that you're conserving indeed. It's a resource, and you're consuming it, and you have to make sure that you're not going over the boundary. Another thing is, as Harriet was saying, this is a very recent notion. So the original papers are about 5 years old. The original write-ups are about 5 years old. So certainly, it takes time to absorb, it takes time to criticize, it takes time perhaps to point errors or whatever, and you have to take this into account. Now, probably, my guess would be if you want to apply it in some realm, some new realm, then the first implementation will probably not be so great. So if any one of you is in charge of funding, you should probably fund some people who would do research on that and find better ways of doing it. But you have to remember, again, as anything new, you have to examine it more carefully. The last point I want to make is, it's a little repetitive, but just I want to answer specifically to a point that Pierre made, that the message that you are trying to convey is that utility and privacy are not mutually exclusive. You can, as far as we know, you can get a lot of utility without hurting any individual's privacy. I'm not saying that it's always the case, but certainly it's possible in a much stronger sense than perhaps people realize.
So the limits of anonymization, if I could summarize a little bit what we've just heard, the limits of anonymization are real. There's a fair amount of work that has been done that shows that those limits exist. To gain the benefit of peering into the data or looking at the patterns it might tell us, but I like this term, conservation of privacy, conserving privacy. I've been educated over the last month that we've been dialoguing that this is one of the most exciting areas of research and advance, but it isn't the only one. And so if you're a regulator, if you're a business person, an academic, a researcher, a person who has funds to fund work like this and is interested in doing it, there are there are opportunities to try to make progress on this, and it will take years. There's another one, another area called homomorphic encryption, and I think somebody mentioned it yesterday. I'm not sure who, and I should say Casper Bowden. I thought I saw him here. There you go. So that's my mention of you in this panel. But it's Casper. It's privacy by design. These concepts and these terms, these names, have been in almost every session. And I think what we're talking about here a little bit is very much like privacy by design, right? It would fit if Ann Kavukian were here. She'd be excited by what she heard, right? Because you know, whether it's this concept or homomorphic encryption, if you actually took the theoretical thought, which is about encrypting information and they being able to go in and manipulate it to try to get insights out of it without uncovering the personal information or the identifiable information inside of the encrypted envelope, if you could take that from theory to operational, that's pretty awesome, to use an American English term. That's pretty important in terms of starting to enable the value without necessarily compromising the privacy aspects. So let me ask Billy, if it's okay, to add the active sitting regulator's point of view, or maybe ask a question, having listened to us talk. We started off with the medical research example. I've talked a little bit about the technology and the limits of relying on current paradigms, the potential new paradigms here. You know, Billy, are you a lawyer? Are you a lawyer? No. Perhaps? No? No, you're a regulator. So at least we have at least 2 lawyers on the panel now, though. And if I'm a lawyer or if I'm a privacy professional or a regulator and I'm starting to think about applying fair information principles to this area, the technology-enabled capabilities that we just talked about are probably one element, or they should be one element of the program. But I've also got to think about compliance with EU laws or laws in the health privacy arena in some other countries, or other norms and industry practices. Any questions or any observations on how one would react to the discussion that we just had here in the context of the obligations that you're responsible for ensuring are followed in your jurisdiction?
Right. Yes, Harriet. I think, first of all, I would very much agree with you that the discussion, particularly the more recent discussion about techniques of conservation of privacy, are very encouraging, and they are an aspect of privacy by design. And given the somewhat scary information we're given in other panels about the data deluge and the alleged impossibility of preserving privacy, I think very much regulators will be looking towards these types of solutions to actually provide an element of conservation of privacy. I was struck also by Paul's suggestion that regulators are going to have to wake up and not depend on the silver bullet of anonymization. Well, I got news for you. We already are in that messy world of balance all the time, in fact, and increasingly so. Certainly, I'm sure our office is no exception in regularly being confronted with situations where there appears to be a public interest in doing research. Then you have to look at the need to protect the privacy of individuals, and is there some in-between solution that addresses both of those and stays within the parameters of the law. Now, I think the much maligned EU regime, in fact, already anticipates, if you like, how to resolve some of these quandaries, for example, in the health area, because the directive provides a very explicit opt-out, as it were, from consent, where you're using data for health research purposes, provided, and then there are qualifiers, provided it's carried out by a health professional or somebody with an equivalent, if you like, obligation of confidentiality. So I think in that area where there's a clear public good, that balance was already anticipated, and if you like, privacy was given a less important value in that balancing act already. I think also many of us, I mean, I'm sure all of us, have, where we have state statistical offices, they are given by law power to access personal data. in order to produce useful statistics. But again, the balancing is that there is draconian penalties prescribed on the officers of statistics if they actually fail in their duty to keep that data confidential. But I think it's when we go outside, I think you correctly said, Harriet, the more obvious areas where there's a public interest like health, that it becomes very messy and the balance becomes messy. And where there you will be looking more and more, I think, to the type of technological solutions that deal with the technological deluge of data. Very much, I think, the need for this type of approach as an important aspect of privacy by design. So I think those will be the challenging areas in the future. They already are the challenging areas and will be more so in the future for regulators.
While Paul talks, prepare a question or two.
So, and I meant no disrespect, and I'm sorry if any were received. I mean, I am not an expert in the EU, but I do watch what the regulators do with significant interest from the other side of the Atlantic. I will say, though, that I think my outsider's assessment of the regulators' response to the questions that we're talking about has been mixed. And some regulators seem to embrace the challenge really well, and some don't. And to be honest, I say this with a bit of trepidation because I'm not sure what your office has said about this, but when I hear that some EU regulators puzzle over whether an IP address fits within the definition of personal data, it frankly hurts my brain. And I don't understand how reasonable people who aren't paid by Google could accept the argument that what we have here, which has a significant reduction in entropy, there's a very low entropy value associated with an IP address, how that is not personal data in any definition of it.
What do you mean by low value of entropy?
Yeah, and you know, it's one of these things I have to
Just
say.
Just a question,
I have to say, if you walk out of this room not understanding differential privacy, I'm with you, right? There's a lot there. If you walk out of this room, I think the one complicated technique, and I've thought for a year now, can we do a better way of describing it? Entropy is such an important concept at this moment to understand, right? And so I'm going to give the lawyer's version of entropy, which goes back to Claude Shannon, it goes back to information theory, but the idea is if I look at a piece of data supposedly anonymized, and I ask myself, how has that data narrowed down the pool of human beings in the world? I can come up with a number, and that number represents entropy. So let's take a very easy example. If I know that the person in the data is from Jerusalem, if I recall, is that the population of Jerusalem is 70,000, 75,000? Or am I wrong?
700.
700,000. I knew I had one digit right. I was converting to dollars. So 700,000 people, that's the entropy value. Now, the one place where Claude Shannon has served us poorly, and computer scientists have followed him down this cliff, is they then convert this to powers of 2, and they talk about the bit value. Just forget about the bit value. So the entropy of that information is about 700,000. If I know that the person is also male, now I'm down to 350,000. Right? So the idea here is an IP address, and you can say what you want about dynamic addressing, DHCP, NAT filtering, etc., is very, very, very low. And so however you define personal data, I would urge you to start thinking about incorporating the idea of entropy. How few are the possible number of people in the world who could be identified by that data? And I think in any reasonable definition of personal data, that should encompass IP address.
So in the lawyer compliance business world that I live in, I use the term risk. And just to translate into my language, the concept would be, look at a data set, look at an activity that you're about to undertake, and think about risk in a holistic manner. Not risk only to the organization, which, harken back to the plenary panel in the morning, it used to be that the organization would think about the risks only to the organization and not necessarily to the individuals that might be affected by the calculations or the project. And I think increasingly, whether it's because of in the U.S. and other jurisdictions, the data breach notification requirements or other associated security or privacy regulatory or norm requirements that have emerged, we're starting to think much more so holistically about risks to the full range of stakeholders. And indeed, I think that's one of the reasons, I know that's one of the reasons we call this the ethics of analytics, because it denotes that, or connotes that, whatever the term is, it says that organizations who are accountable, who are responsible, are needing to make these determinations in a much more thoughtful manner, particularly because, like it or not, the policy frameworks, the regulatory frameworks that we all operate in, or that some of you are responsible for enforcing, are probably not going to keep up, have not kept up with the pace of innovation and change. I mean, that's just the nature of law and the way it works. And with the accelerating progress or the accelerating advances that have been made just in the last, I mean, who would have thought 5 years ago that we'd have what we have today? With that accelerating pace comes almost an imperative for organizations, and I know I feel it in my own, and I feel it as we collaborate with organizations, including the SIPL project I talked about. We've got to run in order to figure out what the right thing to do is. What's the ethical or the right norm to follow as the rest of the world around us kind of adjusts and also figures it out too. So that's just a couple of additional thoughts to just jump on entropy and conservation of privacy and this physics class, just to add the word risk. Cynthia, you want to add something, and then I will go to the audience for questions.
I'm somewhat surprised by what you just said, Paul. I'm not sure what you were thinking anybody was doing with the IP address, but what I expected you to say was that removing the IP address simply gave no guarantee that what remained wasn't identifiable. And that
yeah, no, that's not the problem. The question that's been posed is, if I decline to delete the IP address and I have it associated with all sorts of other sensitive information, is that personal data?
Of course it's personal data, but the problem is that everything else is too.
There are regulators who disagree with you on
well,
that question.
Well, they're wrong.
Okay. Well, that's what I said.
It's just
okay,
obvious.
then. We have a gentleman here in the second row. If you can bring the mic up.
Thank you.
Is he on?
No? Okay. Ran Wolf from University of Haifa. I've been following differential privacy, I think even before it was called that name. And one thing that wasn't stressed enough in my feeling is that it is a worst case model. And my question is, aren't we doing the technological equivalent of the firebrand lawyers we just heard of in the last session? And as a data miner, as somebody who's doing analytics, I can tell you that in my feeling, in the feeling of a lot of other data miners, we're giving up a whole lot of utility, probably much more than we want to give up in the process.
So you're saying this is like taking a super drug when you might just take an aspirin?
And you pay the equivalent, cost.
So that's a you know, anybody in the group want to respond?
So it's true, it's a worst case definition, but for a good reason, because our experience has proved us that we have to take into account worst case. This is exactly, let's take a sophisticated company like Netflix. They thought that by removing individual names, what exactly are you revealing by publishing the data of the records of their movies and the dates when they watched those movies? It sounded completely innocent, but they didn't take into account what Narayan and Shmatikov thought of, that the fact that there is an extra database. Differential privacy takes the view that the adversary knows everything except one particular record. And therefore, it's such a powerful definition. Now, I disagree with the fact that you cannot achieve it in many cases. Experience has shown us that actually it is possible to achieve a lot of utility with it. It's not always possible, but certainly it's possible in many more situations than, let's say, I would have imagined initially. So I think that it's certainly a goal that we have to strive to. And if you are not implementing differential privacy, I think that it's your responsibility to explain why. If you argue that it's impossible in this case, you should provide a reasonable proof that it's impossible in this case, not just say, oh, it's impossible.
Can I add one thing, which is, while we're thinking of papers that should be written next,
Yes?
while we're talking about differential privacy being a very good solution but not a panacea, as your last slide says, I think there's room to write a paper to describe the things you cannot do with differential privacy. I'd be happy to work with either of you on this. For example, could you have done the Netflix Prize competition?
Actually, probably you could.
Probably in the same open crowdsourced way?
Yes.
Okay. That's good. And could you answer the question, has this customer been looking at travel websites recently?
No, it's something for analyzing trends and not looking at the data of individuals. That's exactly what it isn't.
There are anonymized applications that are impossible.
It's the same thing as the rare diseases case.
And so I don't want to leave the regulators with the idea that this will just be a plug-in for every application of anonymization. And even when it can't solve it, it's expensive, it's hard to implement.
I've been around privacy now for 15, something like that, years. And what I've seen happen, and I've been guilty of it myself a couple of cycles, is, wow, we got a new technology solution, and this is really great, and it's going to really do this. And I guess with some perspective, I do happen to agree, moderator prerogative maybe to say, I do happen to agree that there will be I think you made this analogy in your paper, Paul. You kind of deteriorate in one area, you have technology advances that assist in another, and maybe it's like an inchworm or something, but there will be capabilities that emerge. Innovators like these folks will come up with things, but probably no one aspect will be the panacea that will let us, those of us who are policy, legal, regulator, academics, off the hook. So I think that is a key takeaway from this panel, for sure. We got a lot of questions in the audience. So person with the mic, let's see, I think Casper had his hand up, and then the lady next to him, and then the lady in red in the front row. So if you can just kind of go that way.
Casper Bowden. So I think it might help clarify things if we could see that there's maybe two areas of confusion or uncertainty here. There is the sense of identifiability in terms of indirect identifiability or pseudonymity, as Pierre Lastic put it, and that would be the IP address case. And then there's this extremely important new research on what we could call, in an all-encompassing sense, statistical de-anonymization or statistical re-identifiability. Now, in fact, I guess you could look at the two as one as a trivial end of the spectrum of the other. But the situation with indirect identifiability or the IP address issue is very serious because it now crops up with MAC addresses, with cookie identifiers. And let's take the European history of this. Back in 1995, what happened was that the European legislator bungled their assignment. They put into a recital 26, something which was fundamental to the definition of personal data. And this should not have been in a recital, it should have been in an article, because that would have meant it would have been transposed into legislation in a uniform way. And as it was transposed into legislation into the different EU member states in ways which have this crucial ambiguity over whether indirectly identifiable data is personal data. And this has been causing no end of trouble since. Okay. But the thing is, this is not a new discovery. Joel Reidenberg and Paul Schwartz wrote about this in a study for the European Commission and predicted the kind of regulatory arbitrage which we now see. And I think someone has used the phrase of this concept of pseudonymity as being an expedient legal fiction. And we really shouldn't sort of confuse this inexcusable lack of harmonization in that particular respect with this new work on statistical de-anonymization, which, of course, will take some time to get to grips with and will take some time to understand the policy consequences of.
Thank you, Casper.
Casey
I'm sorry, does anybody want to comment on... No? Okay. Stands on its own.
Casey Chappelle from Vodafone. I want to point out another item of disharmony within the European Union, and forgive me for that perspective, I work for a European company. The fact that even in situations were it possible to have perfect anonymization and aggregation, we're still seeing some regulators, some of our more literalist regulators, who look at that first step of statistical analysis and say that at that very first step, you are processing individual information. And under the terms of our current directive, we have an all or nothing approach. It's either personal data or it's not personal data. So as a result, what we're finding is that in those countries that take that approach, obviously we have to rely on things like consent, and transparency, and notice, and control. But we have enough trouble talking about analytics to IBM and to professors and to those of us in the audience. How do we explain that to our users? What words do we use?
Maybe Billy or Pierre might have a comment on that, but it's interesting in the paper that Paul Schwartz is about to issue. He writes about how OECD and APEC guidelines, as they are applied to this area, don't really trigger an analysis around the concept of automated data processing. That thought, which is in the EU directive, isn't necessarily in the guidelines that inform other parts of the world. And the notion of automated data processing, I kind of call it, to use a more colloquial term, I call it the Heisenberg uncertainty principle of data, because and it's very inaccurate. I know for those of you who are physicists, I'm sorry, but it's sort of if you observe data, something changes, and so you must trigger an application of law. And I find that hard to get around my own mind, because if you are starting to do a statistical analysis and may or may not use the information, you be past processing it that way, what obligation should trigger? I think that's partly your issue, is it not?
So I guess my first question is, for the regulators in the room, are we likely to see a more nuanced approach that maybe isn't just black or white, all or nothing? Is it personal, is it not personal?
Yeah.
And my second question is, if we do need to depend on consent as the justification for processing that data,
Two good
how
questions.
do we talk about it?
Yeah. Anybody want to comment? Pierre?
I didn't want to talk about the consent, because I think that it will be leading us to discussion that we will probably have this evening, well, this afternoon,
We already
on
have
personalized medicine, but it's, I think it's unavoidable. It's clear that when we work in the very controlled way of clinical trials, where we have informed consent and very specific informed consent, then it's not really an issue. But if you think about medical progress and analyzing the link between genetic information and some diseases and the way drugs will cure these diseases, then if I want to reuse this data and I have to ask patients and give them a specific information about the kind of research, how can I now know what I will be doing in 10 years at the speed in which information is progressing? It's absolutely impossible to have a really informed consent on all these possible research applications. And here I think we have a real issue, because currently you may have guidances, but I don't think that the law is helping us in any manner here.
That's your cue, Billy.
Thanks a lot. Yes, nothing like easy questions. I think, first of all, on the issues of definitions of personal data, I don't think we're ever going to reach the nirvana of a perfect definition. There isn't one. There never will be one. I think the whole discussion about when exactly an IP address is personal data is emblematic of that. Same issues arise about MAC identifiers. And I think you have a concept which is actually in another preamble of the EU directive about means likely to be used to identify somebody. So I think the judgmental factor it has to be there, and that much as companies, people in technology want black and white definitions, I think if our discussion shows anything, it's that is an impossible dream. You will not get black and white definitions here. You will always be dealing with a messy world where you're trying to get maximum transparency to the user. Consent wherever possible, and real consent based on knowing what information you're giving, balancing issues of public interest versus the individual's right to privacy. And I suppose if it weren't such a messy world, there wouldn't be so many lawyers employed, and I wouldn't have a job. So there's a silver lining to everything.
We are, there are a lot more questions here, but if I can ask the panelists maybe during the coffee break, if folks want to come up and have a further conversation. I think we only have 2 more minutes. So to wrap the conference up, we're in 2010 right now. Let's imagine that we are back in Israel perhaps in 2020. And that's a wonderful year, and it connotes or it implies 2020 is when you look backwards and you have some some vision as to what might happen. If you can, in 1 second or less, or 30 seconds or less, if we're back here in 2020, where do you think we're going to be with big data, better methods, the analytics applied to lots more information? Where will we be in terms of either norms, ethics, law, or technology? And let me just start in the order we went. Pierre?
Small question.
I know, just whatever comes to mind. First association.
You want that in 2 seconds?
Just a second, yeah.
Well, frankly, I'm not very good as an oracle. The only thing that I can foresee is that yesterday we were discussing about the progress in genetics, and now it costs about $5,000 to sequence the entire genome. In 3 or 4 years, it will be $100 per person. In 10 years, it will be probably a commodity that you can go to your pharmacy and order it and get it the next day. So when you look at this kind of possibilities, it's absolutely impossible to foresee. I'm not a prophet, so I will not try to foresee where we are in 2020. I don't think that it is really possible to foresee that today.
That's a very interesting prediction now, or trend.
So I'll be turning 28 that year. So what I want to predict is that right now a lot of our regulations surround what people can do with the data they have. Our future regulation will turn on what they can infer from the data they have. And we will learn that as we move from actual possession of data to inferences from data, our law will look very different. And the phrase I'm using now, I don't love it, is we're going to have to engage more in synthetic privacy. We're going to have to engage in the imposition of privacy by businesses, people, governments, regulators, because it will no longer occur naturally. And that for too long we've relied on naturally occurring technological things, physical things that have given us the baseline privacy that we enjoy. And in the future, in 10 years, it will always be a choice, it will always be imposed, and it will always come at some cost. We're just going to miss the efficiencies that we have today if we still believe in privacy in 10 years.
I'm speechless. We will have harnessed the incredible energy and brain power of the very large number of people who are currently working on differentially private techniques in statistics and databases and programming languages and theoretical computer science, and built a library of extremely accurate and very privacy protective routines for standard data analysis tasks.
Thank goodness.
I'll continue the optimistic line and say that differential privacy will be misused just as a notion, just as entropy is misused now.
And with that, on behalf of the Commissioner and the conference, thank you very much for your participation, and thank you to the panel.